Welcome back to Theology on Ice, a Reformed Catholic podcast. I'm your host, Sean D. Gates, and today I'm here to answer the question of why some Anglicans and some Anglican churches look quite Catholic in practice, and how this character of Anglican worship actually came to be. So thank you for joining, and I invite you now to pull up a chair, light your cigar, and grab your drink so that together we can begin to pour some theology on ice. Here is a strange experience many people have with their first time encountering Anglicanism. You visit one Anglican church and it feels almost indistinguishable from an evangelical Protestant service. You know, there's the preaching, there's the hymns, or even more contemporary music. There's kind of a simple liturgy that's followed, but there's not much ceremony overall. But then you can visit another Anglican parish and suddenly there's priests in the full vestments. There's incense rising during Eucharist, the candles are burning on the altar, weekly communion, and maybe even some Marian feasts on the church calendar. So you find yourself asking a very reasonable question. Can both of these churches belong to the same tradition? Part of that answer, I think, lies in a remarkable revival that began in the 19th century. It's a revival that started not a new denomination, but with a group of Anglican priests and scholars who believed the church had forgotten something essential about its identity. And they believed Anglicanism was not merely Protestant, nor was it simply a compromise between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, but instead it argued that the Church of England was part of something much, much older, the historic Catholic Church. And their effort was to rediscover that identity, and it became known as the Oxford Movement. It began somewhat quietly in the halls of Oxford University, but over time it reshaped Anglican theology, worship, and spirituality, and even the mission. In many ways, the Anglican Church that we know today, with its sacramental worship, its liturgical beauty, and its revival of ancient Christian practices, this all exists because of that one Oxford movement. And so today we're going to explore what was the Oxford movement, why did it begin, what caused so much controversy, and why its legacy still shapes Anglicanism nearly 2 centuries later. Because if you want to understand modern Anglicanism, especially the more Anglo-Catholic or Reformed Catholic expressions of Anglicanism, then you really need to understand the Oxford movement. So, to understand the Oxford movement, we need to understand the crisis that triggered it. In the early 1800s, the Church of England had become closely tied to the British state. Many clergy functioned more like civil political offices rather than as spiritual leaders, and so the church faced several problems. There was the theological stagnation, political control over bishops, and ultimately declining spiritual vitality. So one moment in particular sparked outrage. It was in 1833 when the British government suppressed several Irish dioceses in the Church of Ireland without consulting the church itself. And so for many clergy, this raised a terrifying question. Was the church merely a department of the state, or was it something deeper, a divine institution founded by Christ? And this is the question that really ignited the Oxford movement. The movement was also often said that it began with a sermon preached in 1833 by John Keble. And the sermon was titled National Apostasy. So Keble warned that when a nation interferes with the church's divine authority, it risks abandoning the Christian faith itself. His message was simple, but it was explosive. The church is not merely a national institution, and it is part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church founded by Christ and affirmed in the creeds. So this Oxford movement, it was led by a group of brilliant theologians and clergy associated with Oxford University. And the three most famous leaders of this were John Henry Newman, Edward B. Pusey, and John Keble. So these men believed the Church of England had forgotten its deeper identity, and they argued that Anglicanism was not simply Protestant, nor was it Roman Catholic, but instead they revived the idea that Anglicanism represented a via media, a middle way, preserving the ancient faith while reforming medieval abuses. To spread their ideas, they began publishing a series of pamphlets called Tracts for the Time. These tracts were theological essays addressed to clergy and lay people, and they argued for several important principles. Number one, the Church of England is part of the historic Catholic Church. Number two, apostolic succession matters. Number three, the sacraments are central to Christian life. And number four, the church possesses divine authority independent of the state. So the most controversial tract was actually written by John Henry Newman. In Tract 90, Newman argued that the 39 articles could be interpreted in a way consistent with historic Catholic theology. And this argument, it shocked a lot of Anglicans, and ultimately it led Newman down a path that would dramatically affect the movement. So let's take a look at that. One of these dramatic moments for the Oxford movement came through Newman's personal journey. He was one of the intellectual architects of the movement, and for years he argued passionately that the Church of England was a true branch of the historic Catholic Church. But as he studied the early church more deeply, especially the writings of the church fathers, he began to struggle with difficult questions that he didn't think Anglicanism could answer. He was asking, was Anglicanism truly continuous with the ancient church, or had it, on a more deep level, broken with the tradition that he once believed? And so these questions led Newman into a long period of spiritual turmoil. Ultimately, in 1848, he preached his famous final sermon as an Anglican at St. Mary's in Oxford. The sermon was titled The Parting of Friends, and those who were present sensed that something momentous was happening, and Newman knew that his convictions were shifting and that he might soon leave the Church of England. And so 2 years later, in 1845, Newman was received into the Roman Catholic Church, and his conversion shocked the Anglican world. And for many critics of the Oxford movement, this seemed to confirm their worst fears, that the movement was simply a stepping stone for the Church of England toward Roman Catholicism. But the story did not end there. For other leaders of the movement, especially Edward Pusey and John Keble, they remained firmly within Anglicanism and are really considered fathers of Anglicanism today. They insisted that the Oxford movement was not abandoning the Church of England. Instead, it was about renewing it from within. And so the Oxford movement eventually gave rise to what we now deem Anglo-Catholicism, or a more Reformed Catholic view. Anglo-Catholics embraced the Oxford movement's central insight that Anglicanism should be understood as a Catholic church reformed according to Scripture. This theological vision produced several major developments within Anglican life. First, it revived a strong emphasis on the Eucharist as the center of Christian worship. See, many Anglican parishes had actually celebrated Holy Communion only a few times a year, but the Oxford movement restored the practice of frequent and even weekly Eucharist. And second, it encouraged a renewed appreciation for the sacraments in the spiritual life. Things like confession and spiritual direction, fasting and disciplined prayer, it began reappearing and being giving fresh life within Anglican spirituality. Third, the movement inspired a revival of Anglican religious orders. Communities such as the Society of St. John the Evangelist and the Community of St. Mary emerged directly from the Oxford movement's spiritual vision. And for more on that kind of Anglican monasticism, be sure to check out the previous episode that I just released, episode 18, It goes in more deep depth about some of those things. So then finally, the Oxford movement actually helped to reshape Anglican worship itself. Many of the liturgical practices that now feel normal in Anglican churches, like the vestments or candles, a richer ceremonial worship, taking communion every single week, a lot of those things actually developed during this period. So in other words, much of what people today associate with the beautiful Anglican liturgy is actually the fruit of the Oxford movement. So at the heart of the Oxford movement was a really simple but a radical claim. It says the Church of England is not merely Protestant, it is part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So the Oxford leaders believed that the Reformation had purified the Church of England from certain medieval errors, but that it had not destroyed its Catholicity. Being a Catholic church does not mean embracing error. Being a Catholic church means being the one true church that ended up going back to Christ, not in an exclusive way, but in a apostolic way. So the Oxford leaders really emphasized that the Church of England had not destroyed its Catholic identity. And this idea was often expressed with the famous phrase, "The Church of England is Catholic, though Reformed." So for the Oxford theologians, Anglicanism was not meant to be some compromise between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. Instead, it was understood as a continuation of the ancient church in England, preserving apostolic ministry, sacramental life, and historic liturgy. John Henry Newman, he once wrote for the Tracts of Times, he says, "We are not merely Protestants, but we are members of the one Catholic Church." So that kind of shows a little bit of where their mind was at. And similarly, Edward Pusey insisted that Anglicanism must remain deeply rooted in the theology of the early church fathers. So for the Oxford movement, the standard for Christian doctrine was not simply the controversies of the 16th century. It was the faith of the first millennium, of Christianity. The emphasis on the early church actually helped to spark a massive revival of patristic study within Anglican theology, and something that it still influences Anglican scholarship even today. So the Oxford movement, it unfortunately did not unfold entirely peacefully. As Anglo-Catholic ideas began to spread, some clergy began introducing more traditional liturgical practices into Anglican worship. And these practices, as we discussed, are the Eucharistic vestments, candles on the altar, incense, actually facing eastward in the celebration of the Eucharist, and frequent communion. Some even led to celebrating the Eucharist ad orientem rather than versus populum. So today, these things feel very normal in Anglican churches, but in Victorian England, they were explosive. Many Protestants believed that these practices were just attempts to secretly restore Roman Catholicism. And we can't say that this is entirely unfounded. If we just take a brief look at the history of Anglicanism in England, we can see so many different times where the monarchy goes back and forth between Anglican and Catholic. And so it's a genuine concern on the continent that the monarchy is going to try to push Catholic again, just after Protestantism has really been established and England is the strong house of Protestantism. So to see that the Church of England is trying to make some of these reforms through this Oxford movement, it was genuinely a scary thing for many Protestants, making them think that secretly Roman Catholicism was entering its way back into the Church of England. And so this resulted in a conflict that became known as the Ritualist controversy. So some Anglo-Catholics the clergy were prosecuted in civil courts for their liturgical practices. One of the most famous cases involved Alexander, I'm going to say his last name wrong. It's Maconochi. That's not right. But anyway, you get the idea. Real person. He was a priest, and he was repeatedly disciplined for introducing ritual practices such as altar candles and incense. So several priests were actually imprisoned under the Public Worship Regulation Act of 1874, and this attempted really to suppress ritualist practices. And these conflicts reveal just how controversial the Oxford movement truly was. What many Anglicans now take for granted, like the liturgical vestments, candles, and weekly communion, those were once fiercely contested innovations. So, moving on to a slightly different thing, the effect of the Anglo-Catholic movement, one of the most surprising fruits of this Oxford movement was its influence on social ministry. In the late 19th century, England's rapidly growing cities, because of the Industrial Revolution just before this, they were filled with poverty, disease, and they were overcrowded with housing. So large portions of the urban poor had very little contact with the church at all. And so many Anglo-Catholic priests believed that the sacramental vision of the Oxford movement demanded something radical. The church must go to the poorest and the most forgotten neighborhoods. So clergy, inspired by the movement, they began establishing missions in some of the most dangerous and impoverished areas of London and other industrial cities. So one notable example of this is the ministry of Charles, I think it's Fuge Lowder. Lowder founded the Society of the Holy Cross, a fraternity of Anglo-Catholic priests committed to intense sacramental ministry and pastoral care among the urban poor. You see, these priests served communities that were suffering from extreme poverty, epidemic disease, alcoholism, and even child labor. So they celebrated the Eucharist daily, they heard confessions, they visited the sick, and they provided charity to these struggling families. And so during outbreaks of diseases, many Anglo-Catholic clergy risked their lives by caring for the sick, and some even died while serving in these communities. But what makes this story so striking is that the Oxford movement was often accused of being overly ceremonial or obsessed with liturgy. Yet, in practice, many of its followers became some of the most devoted missionaries to the poor in Victorian England. Their theology of the Incarnation, the belief that God entered human life through Christ, actually led them to believe that Christian ministry must also enter into the darkest places of society. And these stories, they reveal something important about the Oxford movement itself. It was not merely an academic debate among Oxford scholars, but it reshaped Anglican identity in two very different directions. On one hand, it produced deep theological reflection about the nature of the church, and on the other hand, it inspired a sacrificial ministry among the poor and the marginalized. The Oxford movement reminded Anglicans that the church's mission involves both the altar and the street, sacramental worship and social mission. The beauty of holiness and the care of the suffering, for many Anglo-Catholics, those two things were never meant to be separated. Now, I don't want to caricature this as some beautiful thing, that it was just the glorious revolution of the Church of England, because I know that there are more nuances to that. And there are a lot of other Anglicans who would disagree with me and say that the Oxford movement was actually not the goal of Anglicanism, and it achieved something altogether foreign to the Anglican cause. And I don't want to caricature their argument either. But I do want to say that there are some people who feel very strongly about the Oxford movement in a negative way, and saying that it did add too much Roman Catholicity to the Anglican Communion. And so I don't want to override that by simply painting a utopian view of the Oxford movement. I know that it had some of its own failures, and I know that it did some things that maybe a lot of Anglicans aren't entirely thrilled with. My personal view, my very personal, human and completely subject to error view, was that the Oxford movement was actually a very beautiful movement within the Anglican Church, and that it really does still matter today. Because here's why. The Oxford movement began as a response to crisis. Its leaders feared the Church of England was losing a spiritual identity, and their solution was not to invent something new, but instead they looked backward to Scripture, to the early church, and the ancient traditions of Christian worship. And by doing so, they helped Anglicans to rediscover something that is deeply rooted within their own history. And so I think that's why the Oxford movement raises one of the most important developments of modern Anglicanism. It reminded the church that Anglican identity is not defined merely by what it rejected during the Reformation, but also is defined by what it preserved from the Christian tradition. And that rediscovery continues shaping Anglican life. So nearly 2 centuries have passed since the Oxford movement, but its influence is still surrounds us. So here's the thing. If you walk into an Anglican church today, and if you see priests that are wearing vestments, that's, the collar and the cassock and all of the words are leaving my brain now. But you have the stoles and you have the Felonian, you know what I mean? The really cool, colorful capes that they wear. And if you see candles that are burning on the altars, if you see that your church is celebrating Eucharist every single week, and if you have even heard of Anglican monasteries, or if you know of Anglicans who have particular devotions to the saints, or if you have a priest who actually hears your confessions, and if you use the Book of Common Prayer for your liturgical worship very strictly in a beautiful way, not in a way that is restrictive, then you are seeing the legacy of the Oxford movement. All of those things were relatively foreign before the Oxford movement. So much of what modern Anglicans experience as just normal parish life, much of what defines Anglican identity today, was once deeply controversial. And before the 19th century, Holy Communion was really just celebrated a few times a year. But in many Anglican churches, the weekly celebration of the Eucharist is what brings so many congregants in. Liturgical ceremonial was minimal, but as talked also in just the previous episode, monastic life had been absent from Anglicanism for centuries too. So the Oxford movement helped Anglicans to rediscover something ancient. And the idea was that the Church of England was not simply Protestant, it was an institution created by Jesus Christ. It's part of the Catholic Church. And that vision was articulated very powerfully by Edward Pusey, who argued that Anglicanism must be rooted in the faith of the early church fathers and the sacramental life of Christianity. So for leaders of the movement, the Reformation was not meant to erase the past, but it was meant to purify the church by going back to the past. And in that sense, the Oxford movement was not an attempt to make Anglicanism Roman Catholic, but it was to remind Anglicans of their own inheritance: Scripture, sacrament, apostolic ministry, and the theology of the ancient church. So when you hear the term Anglo-Catholics, you might essentially associate that with Anglicans who look very Roman Catholic. But it doesn't say Anglo-Roman Catholics. It says Anglo-Catholic, because it's reverting back to the Catholic faith of the early church, not the Roman Catholic faith. Roman Catholics aren't the only ones who get to claim Catholicism. Anglicans are Catholic also. And so if your practices look liturgical or very high church or sacramental and historical, apostolic, then you can rightfully call yourself an Anglo-Catholic. So at its best, the movement challenged Anglicans to rediscover the fullness of Christian life, not only intellectual theology, but also prayer, holiness, and devotion. The Oxford movement reminds us that renewal in the church often begins in unexpected ways. See, this one began with a sermon. It grew out of a handful of university theologians who were just writing pamphlets. But ultimately, it reshaped worship, theology, and the spiritual life across the Anglican world. So perhaps that is the deeper lesson. The church is always being called back to its sources, back to Scripture, back to the early church, and back to the sacraments and especially back to holiness. And so whenever Christians rediscover those things, renewal follows. And that was the hope of the Oxford movement. And in many ways, it remains the hope of Anglicanism today. So this has been another episode of Theology on Ice, a Reformed Catholic podcast. And I am still your host, Sean D. Gates. I hope that this episode helped to introduce you to the Oxford movement and deepened your understanding of Anglo-Catholicism. As always, please, if you have any questions, thoughts, or ideas for future episodes, leave them in the comments below. Also, feel free to subscribe to this channel so that you'll be notified anytime a new episode is released. Thank you so much for listening. I can't wait for next time when I will invite you back to pull up a chair, light your cigar, and grab your drink so that together we can once again pour some theology on ice. God bless.